It's no secret this society is truly struggling to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, between what is good and what is evil, between what is true and what is false. And I hope it's not too late to ask this question, but how can we even tell the difference between right and wrong? And what if we disagree? I'm a Christian, maybe you're an atheist. Is there any common ground between us? Or are we destined in this society to browbeat each other over and over again? I know, at the end of the day, each of us has got to follow our own conscience. But what does that actually mean? When people say that they need to follow their conscience, don't they actually mean I'm pretty much going to do whatever it is that I wanted to do anyways? I mean, what I'm getting at here is it even possible to discern moral truth at all? We'll discuss that next, but first, as always, we start with our mission. Always remember, God created us for this time and for this place. If we learn this faith, if we live this faith, if we share this faith, what will the next 100 years look like? Join the mission. Earlier this week on the 1 Peter 5 podcast, Timothy Flanders had a great interview with Father Chad Ripperger. If you haven't seen it, I'll put the link in the description below. They discussed the collapse of moral theology that has occurred over the course of the last century or so. And Father spent a long time explaining that traditionally the basis, the foundation of moral theology was natural law. But in modern times that was jettisoned, and consequently today, I think it's fair to say that most people have little to no understanding of what natural law is in the first place. So Father raised a very good point, one that I think is very essential for the crisis that we're experiencing in society today. Who are you to tell me what is right and what is wrong, especially if we're of different faiths or different religions? What might be right for you may not be right for some. And that's it. At the heart of this issue, with the loss of an understanding of natural law, morality has become very subjective. Today, when someone says that they need to follow their conscience, you really get the feeling that what they are saying is that they're going to do whatever it is that they wanted to do to begin with. Today, we see this play out all the time in politics. A few weeks back, we discussed the claim made by Nancy Pelosi. She said that whatever she believes is not necessarily what public policy should be in the United States. She's under the illusion that following her conscience is somehow divorced from objective truth, and that her private beliefs should not influence her public actions. So, what does it mean to follow your conscience? To understand Aquinas' teaching on conscience, we must take a moment first to grasp what he means by natural law, because natural law is going to be the objective norm that grounds human conscience. Now, already you can see where we lost the moderns because, well, they reject any form of objective norms to begin with. Natural law, simply put, is this movement that all created things have towards their own good or their own flourishing, the arrow to the target. We call this a thing's end. For example, a tree produces fruit. Now, humans are unique among creatures because we are rational and we can discern what it is that is good for us, what leads to our flourishing, and so we can reason that we flourish through self-preservation, sexual union, goodness, truth, and social order. So acts that contradict these frustrate our nature rather than fulfill it. Things like theft, murder, suicide, lying, promiscuity, just to name a few. So with this basis of natural law, let's look at Thomas's understanding of conscience. For Thomas, there are two things at play here, a rational habit and a rational act. The rational habit he calls synderesis. The rational act he calls, in Latin, conscientia, or simply conscience. But first, synderesis is the rational habit of recognizing those first principles of the natural law, and he will say that this knowledge is infallible and unchanging. We know as a first principle that murder is wrong because it frustrates our tendency towards self-preservation and social order. But because of fallen nature, this knowledge may be darkened, but even so, Aquinas says it is part of human nature to have certitude on these first principles. Conscience, on the other hand, refers to the act by which this knowledge of synderesis is applied to a particular case. I like the way a theologian named Tobias Huffman put it. He described it as a conclusion made from an ethical syllogism, in which the first principles of synderesis serve as the major premise and practical reasoning serves as the minor premise. So perhaps something like this. Murder is wrong, this particular act is murder, therefore this particular act is wrong. Now, we've all heard it said that conscience should be properly formed, and Hoffman's use of logic here helps to demonstrate precisely why. A conscience should be properly formed because, as a conclusion of a syllogism, if either premise is wrong, consequently the conscience can be in error. So, a premise may be wrong due to either vincible or invincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance is a deliberate neglect to learn something that you were able to learn and should have learned. So, for example, someone might be ignorant of the scientific data which is now available that shows that an embryo is a living human person. Perhaps they're so attached to their political affiliations that they refuse to even look at the data. Invincible ignorance, on the other hand, is an ignorance that either could not be overcome or there was no obligation to overcome it. Now, this is important. The conscience may be certain, doubtful, or erroneous. In the case of doubt, an individual is obliged to seek proper knowledge prior to acting. But St. Thomas teaches that in the case of both an erring as well as a certain conscience, that one is morally responsible to act according to their conscience. The reason for this is that whether or not a conscience is erring, an individual who believes that their conscience is right, but still chooses to act against it, is making a willful decision to act against God. Now, I've thrown a lot of terms at you, but it's important to emphasize that among all of these definitions, it is virtue that has a preeminent role in the act of conscience, and no virtue is more crucial than the virtue of prudence, because it is through prudence that one develops the habit of right reason. So in a nutshell, this is the traditional Thomistic understanding of conscience. But as we are all well aware, this is not what people mean today when they say that they need to follow their conscience. When people say that, you kind of get the sense that what they mean is that they're pretty much going to do whatever it is that they wanted to do, regardless of any objective morality. I'm going to act out my own preferences. Who are you to tell me that I shouldn't? I like what another theologian, Reinhard Hutter, called this a counterfeit conscience. He explains that in this modern sense, conscience does not refer to an act that defers to an objective external rule, but instead defers to subjective individual sovereign acts of self-determination. He explains that this modern tendency removes from the individual the responsibility to form their conscience to an objective moral standard, and conscience becomes synonymous with the actualization of preference. And so, in effect, each person becomes vincibly ignorant. So, how did we get to this point? From objective norms to subjective individual sovereign acts of self-determination. It was during the modernist movement that the traditional Thomistic understanding of the moral life was challenged by revisionists who thought of it as too legalistic. They were led by theologians such as Bernard Häring, and they developed a new system called Proportionalism. Now, for Häring, the idea of individual freedom was key. It was the most essential part of the moral act. And the existence of an external objective standard, the Thomistic approach of natural law, forced an individual to conform to something outside of himself. And for Häring, this contradicted individual freedom. He believed that an individual acting according to an external norm is not truly free and therefore cannot make valid moral decisions. Instead, modernist moral theologians wanted people to develop into moral agents on their own without depending on external norms. They called this goal personal discernment. And unlike the traditional view, which was oriented towards the good, this discernment was instead focused on personal growth, towards an ideal. So there was no longer a need for natural law or even synderesis, and these concepts were just abandoned. Because of their emphasis on personal freedom, proportionalists wanted the individual to apply their own intentions, circumstances, and consequences to their own moral reasoning, and so as a result, they would reject the traditional view that finds some acts to be intrinsically evil. Now, it was in Veritatis Splendor, St. John Paul II responded to this movement, and he points out that proportionalism seems to have overemphasized the conscience to such an extent that they nearly redefined what is meant by the term. Rather than viewing it as a rational act, it is considered to be the totality of the person. Think back to what I mentioned a moment ago, what Hutter called a counterfeit conscience. It removes the external objective standard and makes morality subjective. It becomes an application of personal preference, not based on an immovable natural law, but based on an individual's experiences and values. So in Veritatis Splendor, St. John Paul reaffirms the traditional view that for an act to be good, the object, the intention, and the circumstance must all be good. He also addresses their misunderstanding of human freedom. He explained that objective norms, such as natural law, do not in any way impair human freedom, but natural law and teleology in general reveal how it is that humans flourish. The Christian understanding of human freedom is that a human is free when they're flourishing, when they're reaching their purpose. And ultimately, it is in our union with God that we are fully and completely free, that we fully and completely flourish. It is in our union with God that we are truly free. This is the very purpose or the end of human freedom to begin with, that we may order ourselves to union with God. The kids who got into these vans weren't just leaving home, they were leaving behind the culture of their parents, their values, their traditions, to create a new world, a better world. So what do you think? Did it work? Is this a better world? Or have we become more selfish, more self-absorbed?